Please be seated. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Colonel Art Athens. I have the honor and privilege of serving as the director of the Naval Academy Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, and I'd like to welcome you to the William C. Stutt Ethics Speaker Series. Mr. Stutt, for whom the lecture is named, is a 1949 graduate of the Academy, where he lettered on the varsity lacrosse team. He served for 5 years in the Navy and then began postgraduate work at the London School of Economics and earned a master's in business administration from Harvard. Mr. Stutt joined the investment firm Goldman Sachs and eventually became a limited partner in this prestigious firm. Mr. and Mrs. Stutt established this speaker series in 2005. They established this speaker series because they understood the importance of thinking deeply about ethics, character, and leadership while one attends the academy and before one enters the fleet and the operating forces. Tonight is an opportunity for us to fulfill the Stutt's vision as we listen, reflect, and then take action. Our distinguished and accomplished guest speaker tonight is Mr. Jim Frederick. Mr. Frederick is a contributing editor at Time, the author of highly acclaimed books about North Korea and Iraq, and a journalist and media consultant. Until April 2013, he was the editor of Time International, where he managed Time's global news staff and oversaw all international news coverage, appearing in its 4 global print and tablet editions on Time.com and other digital and mobile platforms. Previous to being the editor of Time International, he was managing editor of Time.com, where he led a record-breaking increase in traffic and the brand's social media presence. While he was editor of Time.com, Time won an Emmy for its groundbreaking website, Beyond 9/11, Portraits of Resilience. Additionally, Mr. Frederick has been the senior editor for Time in London, the Times Tokyo bureau chief, and the senior editor for Money magazine, and has appeared often on radio and TV, including CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, 60 Minutes, and NPR. Mr. Frederick is a graduate of Columbia University and the Stern School of Business at New York University. With all of his prestigious assignments and numerous accolades, we asked Mr. Frederick to come tonight primarily because he wrote a magnificent book entitled Black Hearts: One Platoon's Descent into Madness in Iraq's Triangle of Death. This book provides a penetrating examination of morality and character in war, a book which The Guardian called the best book by far about the Iraq War, a rare combination of cold truth and warm compassion. We are most fortunate to have Mr. Frederick with us this evening to address leadership and accountability in the 21st century. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Frederick.
Good evening. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Good evening to our distinguished guests, and thank you to the Stockdale Center and to Mr. and Mrs. Stutt for funding and sponsoring this lecture series. Most of all, though, I'd like to thank the class of 2016, you, the future leaders of the United States Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps. Your career of service is just beginning, but I can guarantee you that the world and America's role in it is only going to get more complicated, and the challenges that you will face as leaders will correspondingly only become more complex and difficult. That you have taken this challenge on is both inspiring and humbling to me, and it's a very great honor to be addressing you here tonight. This is an extraordinary experience for me to be here tonight. My older brother went to West Point, which made my father extremely proud and opened me up to a lot of pressure to go to a service academy myself, particularly Navy. I had other plans, though, and as proud as my father has been about what I've achieved since then, I get an extra thrill knowing that now he can tell everybody that he has a son who's been to Annapolis. So thanks very much for that. I've been asked here tonight to talk about leadership, ethics, and morality. And it's my understanding that all of you are second years and that you've completed or are taking a course called Moral Reasoning for Naval Leaders. The ethics and morality of warfare, and in particular the role of leadership in ethical warfighting, is something that I've spent the last several years thinking a lot about. I've never fought in a war, although as a journalist I've been to my fair share of war zones. But as the Colonel just introduced, I've written a book about the Iraq War called Black Hearts. And it started as a war story, or at least I thought it was going to be a war story. I thought I was writing a story about arms and men and a deployment, about a particular deployment of a particular unit at a particular time and place. But as I worked on the book, I realized that the events of that deployment contained some universal lessons for human conduct, especially for those seeking to be moral and upstanding leaders in the most pressing of circumstances. It's an army story, that's true, but it really is a military story, a leadership story, and a human story. And it is my understanding that not all of you, or perhaps not even many of you, have read this book, and that's okay. But you really should, but that's a different issue. So acknowledging that a lot of you haven't read it, to help discuss the universals that I've found in this book, I'm going to have to give you a little background about what Black Hearts is about and how the events unfolded. So it's the tale of a one-year deployment of a company of men, an infantry company. So that's Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 502nd Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division, to a 330 square mile region just south of Baghdad that had come to be known as the Triangle of Death. This deployment took place from late 2005 to late 2006. So this was before the surge. This was before COIN doctrines were pushed deep into the field. This was before the Anbar Awakening, before the Sons of Iraq program, before Muqtada al-Sadr told mostly his Shia militias to stand down. So this is basically the war's most dangerous place at its most dangerous time. And I first became interested in this deployment in mid-2006 when I was working for Time, and I read an online news report about 3 soldiers from 1st Battalion, 502nd Infantry Regiment who'd been overrun at a remote checkpoint just south of Baghdad. 1 soldier was dead on the scene and 2 were missing, presumed kidnapped. As the search played out over the next 3 or 4 days, the missing soldiers' bodies were ultimately found, mutilated, burned, beheaded, and booby-trapped with explosives. And after about 2 weeks after that, I saw another story from Iraq, which in many ways, unbelievably, was actually worse, that 4 U.S. soldiers had been charged with the rape, murder, and burning of a 14-year-old Iraqi girl, as well as the murder of her parents and her 6-year-old sister. Now those soldiers' units was also 1st Battalion, 502nd Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. And working on other things, I was sort of distracted. It took me a little while to figure out that the soldiers that were arrested and the soldiers that were overrun were not just from the same company, they were from the same platoon. So really, up to that point, the 2 most catalyzing events of the entire war had happened within a very close span of time, and they'd happened within a group of the same 35 men. So that led me to wonder what could possibly have been going on in this platoon, and were the 2 events related, and I just felt this journalistic need to get to the bottom of it. So now I had my mission. I followed the trials of the accused soldiers, and I spoke to almost everyone involved in that deployment, and I became obsessed with trying to figure out how the unthinkable actually happens. And it is true that to some degree the travails of Bravo Company are a study of the tactical consequences that emerge from a flawed strategy. With far fewer troops and resources than were necessary for them to complete their job, the battalion either found or got hit by nearly 900 IEDs, they were shelled or mortared almost every day, and they took fire from rifles, machine guns, or RPGs nearly every other day. Bravo Company, within this battalion, was particularly hard hit. Within its first 90 days in theater, all 3 of its platoon leaders, its first sergeant, a squad leader, a team leader, and several riflemen had been wiped from the battlefield through either serious injury or death. By the end of the deployment, 51 of Bravo's 135 soldiers had been killed or wounded. So this was an ill-starred tour. These men suffered greatly. But to my mind, too many participants in this deployment were content to just leave it at that, chalking it up to the notion that some units are unlucky and some units are unlucky. And most distressingly to me, in the face of criminal behavior, although the 4 soldiers who committed the crime were severely punished, the Army's senior leadership at this time seemed to be content to consider the behavior as a couple of rogue soldiers for which they could have no warning. It was just one of those things, was the early indication as I started some of my research. But there was far more to the story than that. It was not just one of those things. As I studied the unit, I kept coming back to the deployment's chain of events and a concept known in aviation circles as the error chain. Even with the best of intentions, men and women make errors in judgment and initiate courses of action that are counterproductive to their goals. Fortunately, in complex environments, individual errors or even long chains of errors often simply dissipate, or they are corrected before any adverse effect can be caused. Decisions from different people about the same goal either negate each other or reinforce each other, and the preponderance of these heaped together decisions pushes the task towards, we hope, completion rather than failure. But sometimes in the permutations of literally millions of decisions from thousands of actors over a period of weeks or months, a singular combination comes together that unlocks something truly abhorrent. And March 12, 2006 was one such disaster. That's the date of the rape and quadruple murder. Nothing can absolve the 4 soldiers from the personal responsibility that is theirs and theirs alone for what they did to that family. But this is where the story has a broader applicability. The events of those days were preventable. Despite the Army's initial protestations that Stephen Green was an unknown and unknowable threat to discipline and good order, the fact is that leading up to that day, there's an error chain a mile long. There's a litany of miscommunications, organizational snafus, lapses in leadership, ignored warning signs and red flags, all up and down the chain of command about the known dysfunction of that small group of soldiers. Within an error chain, all it takes is one courageous, accurate decision to avert a catastrophe. As I met and interviewed almost all of the soldiers and officers involved in the main arc of the events of that day and in Black Hearts, there's no doubt that all of them were doing their best, trying to make smart decisions under fire in unspeakably difficult and dangerous circumstances. There's no doubt that their heart was in the right place. They were trying to do their best. And yet, while there was a tiny, tiny fraction of this unit that actually planned and perpetrated a truly heinous deed, there were a litany of bad decisions that, considering the outcome of the deployment, do take on a moral dimension. Years after that fact, an officer by the name of Sean Umbrell, commander of that battalion's headquarters and headquarters company, remarked to me, clearly a lot of what happened out there can be attributed to a leadership failure. And I'm not just talking about the platoon. I'm talking about platoon, company, battalion, and brigade. Even I feel in some way indirectly responsible for what happened out there. I mean, we were all part of the same team, and we just let it go. And we let it go, and we let it go. And then these things happened. And you can say it was Green's fault, he was a criminal. But it goes beyond that. We failed those guys by letting them be out there without a plan. And so, as you prepare to take your first junior leadership positions within the Navy, I ask that you never stop looking for places where you can be the one to break the error chain. And I have a couple of suggestions and a couple of areas on how you might do that. These pointers are fairly bossy. I have a lot of admonishments for you ahead. But you're about to undertake a profession of the utmost seriousness with very little margin for error. And I learned a lot about how to conduct my life and my own leadership roles from my experience reporting out Black Hearts. I learned a lot about how you only get one chance to make your mark on this earth. And though the story is pretty dark, I did find that some of the broader messages that I learned were extraordinarily energizing and educational, and I hope that you'll find them that too. So, number one, be very suspicious of all the flattery that's heaped upon you, and do not believe your own PR. Now, I'm assuming that most of you here can drive an automobile. So if we just do a little experiment. How many of you consider yourself very good drivers? Hands up. Okay. That's almost all of you. How many consider yourselves average drivers? And how many consider yourselves poor to bad drivers? Okay. You might not be surprised, but there were far more than is statistically possible among you that thought that you were very good drivers. Studies show that everybody thinks they're a good driver, even the bad ones. After 3 years of speaking to military leaders of literally every possible rank who were involved what could charitably be described as a less than wholly successful deployment, I didn't meet a single officer who told me that they were bad at their job during that deployment or had been promoted beyond their capabilities. I think Black Hearts makes a fairly persuasive case that there were some very good leaders in 1st Battalion and there were some very poor ones. And quite reliably, those who had the highest opinions of themselves were, in my opinion, the weakest leaders. People's capacity for self-deception, especially in the face of failure, is bottomless. And many people will work incessantly to seek refuge in some corner or rationalization that a bad outcome was just luck or something beyond their control. Truly, the most enlightened leaders that I met out of this experience were those who acknowledged their share of the responsibility, attempted to learn something from it, and incorporated those lessons back into their life moving forward. So always be self-critical, and always be on guard of being overly full of yourselves. Number two, do not fall for cliches, and do not mistake talking about leadership as actually leading. This unit's battalion commander from Black Hearts and his staff had a full assortment of slogans and axioms about leadership that they espoused almost endlessly. They talked incessantly about engaged leadership, about how important it was to teach, coach, mentor, that their soldiers, how they always advocated that their soldiers do the harder right versus the easier wrong. They had these things at the tip of their tongue all the time. But when it mattered most, they almost never practiced what they preached. As 1st Platoon degraded before their very eyes, they were either unable or unwilling to acknowledge just how impaired 1st Platoon had become. So all the maxims and slogans that the military throws around are great if they serve to remind you to do the right thing at the right time. But they do run the risk of becoming meaningless boilerplate and lulling into thinking that if you've said the words, then you've done the deed. Number three, when faced with dysfunction, diagnose, do not belittle. Once it became overwhelmingly obvious that 1st Platoon was underperforming, this unit's leadership did not attempt to systematically assess and diagnose the situation, apply correctives, and monitor further progress. Instead, they turned on the platoon. They belittled its incapacity, telling them that they were wallowing in self-pity and blaming its platoon-level leadership for all of its problems. Rather than helping the situation, this response actually exacerbated it. Turning on the platoon heightened its feelings of isolation and persecution and contributed to an even more rapid downward plunge. There is no doubt that the Pygmalion effect is real. Expected to fail, 1st Platoon indeed began to fail even worse. And after a while, they began to consciously and subconsciously fulfill the role of losers and incompetents. They lived up to their role as outcasts, misfits, and black sheep. They began to become even perversely proud of it. It was, in retrospect, a self-fulfilling prophecy. So this unit was isolated from the rest of the battalion geographically and more crucially, I think, psychologically. And I think that's a hugely important factor for you guys. because I believe that most of your important leadership tests will be aboard ships where it may well be impossible to be separated geographically, but don't let that lull you into a false sense of security. Under such tight quarters, I would be especially vigilant about monitoring your subordinates for a psychological isolation that's almost more crippling. Number 4, take in far more data than you give out. You guys need to learn to heed the trouble signs of a unit in trouble. All of the following should alert you that your subordinates require a second or a third or even a fourth look. Are your people giving you incomplete information? Is the information ambiguous? Are there discrepancies with what they are telling you and what you know to be true from other sources? Are your people distracted, confused, or anxious for any overly long period of time? Likewise, are they demonstrating persistent anti-authoritative streaks? Are they acting impulsively? Are they taking on an air of invulnerability? Or, conversely, are they acting with an air of resignation or futility? The units I examined and wrote about exhibited every single one of these behaviors, and in almost every instance, leaders found a way to rationalize away what they were hearing. All of those kind of data points were pushed away as irrelevant or not important, but they were hugely important. They were warning signs that the unit was in trouble. Number 5, you have to speak up. The military is a unique institution where the accomplishment of the mission trumps virtually everything, even the safety and welfare of one's own people when necessary. It's the one area of human endeavor where leaders can and do and are often expected to order their followers to their deaths. Obviously, there are limits. Push your subordinates too much or work them too hard, and soon enough you will have no more war fighters at all. So you must find the appropriate balance between mission accomplishment and force protection. For Bravo Company and all of 1st Battalion, this balance was particularly tenuous. Throughout their deployment, Bravo soldiers were constantly being asked to outrun the long-form limits of human endurance. This is also, I think it's a fact. I think they were just being asked to do things that human beings couldn't do for any length of time, prolonged length of time. So now, if you were put in that leadership position, what would you do? The military is not a culture that tolerates the answer no or we can't. A commander could and arguably should remove that person on the spot. Either you do it or I'll find someone who can is the default military response to someone who even begins to say no to a direct lawful order. But there's far more to this issue than just direct lawful orders. And that is the gray area that I imagine will be most challenging to you as a military officer. In one area of the battalion's area of operations, some senior non-commissioned officers and junior officers became convinced that their superiors were changing the story to reflect what their superiors wanted to hear, not the truth. One first sergeant asserted that not only was the troops to task math not working out, but the battalion's leadership was lying on their staffing reports to headquarters. This is a quote. "They would call 3 guys a squad," he said, "but you can't turn 3 guys into 9 guys unless you are lying." They were bullshitting brigade. They were sending up reports saying that, yes, this particular checkpoint is manned, but the guidance is that you have to have at least a squad out there with 2 vehicles. And so if you're not doing that, you're bullshitting them. This same company's executive officer told me, and this quote is a little long, but I think it's worth it. Quote, "Nobody would stand up, and the people who do stand up got squashed. The problem clearly had to do with lack of manpower, but there's a culture in the military of just keeping your mouth shut and for some reason saying you can do stuff even when you can't. And when people underneath see people who would try to speak truth to power getting crushed, it showed them that speaking the truth didn't pay. So what that means is that you have people at the top are getting bad feedback. You can get reports that XYZ is fine when XYZ is not fine. In fact, XYZ is the opposite of fine. It's not that that one little piece of information is going to lose the war, but when you see the cumulative effect of information becoming distorted or washed in order to tell a story that a commander wants to tell their hires, then you got real problems. That's the sinister side of it. That's the end of the quote. And that indeed is the sinister side of it. As Admiral William McRaven recently told a class of cadets at West Point, the greatest risk is not on the battlefield, but in standing up for what's right. All officers are expected to take risks in battle. The truly great officer knows that real victory is achieved when men and women of character take professional risks and challenge the weak-kneed, the faint of heart, the indecisive, and the bullies. So as I was doing my research, it was clear that many junior officers thought that overall the unit was being run in a toxic and unsafe way. And even though I've never served in the military, I am abundantly familiar with the magnitude of what I am saying here. But if you know something is wrong with the way your superiors are running your unit, you have to say something. You can do it in private. You can expect to be ignored or even chastised. If the problems are serious enough or the climate is toxic enough, it may be career damaging or even career ending. But as students of moral philosophy, you in fact have no choice. You owe it to your conscience, your integrity, the Navy, and your country to say something. Many junior officers from the deployment that I wrote about fell back on familiar coping strategies that we have all employed and we employ to this day. Out of sight, out of mind, they would say. I'm just following orders. If my superiors tell me it's okay, then it's okay. It's not my place to say anything. It's not my problem. And many of them have told me that they now regret letting themselves take those easy rationalizations out. So, make up your own mind and act accordingly. Number 5, figure out your values, cultivate humility, and communicate. Leaders often fail because they don't actually stand for anything other than the existing power structure itself. So I would say to you right now, even though you are already within the structure of the military, you do have several years to make sure that your individual moral compass is set and honed, to define the things that are most important to you. And while you can course correct for the rest of your life, if you don't have a working foundation before you leave here and are not able to communicate it in your daily life and your work, when it really matters, your subordinates just might fail you because thanks to you, they won't know what right looks like. Number 6, lead from the front. Do not subject your subordinates to dangers or hardships that you are not willing to take yourself. I cannot stress this one highly enough, and this, I think, is one of the root causes that 1st Platoon fell apart. Go where the conditions are the worst. And this advice need not apply just to ground combat. Whatever position, whatever branch you are in, find the toughest, most dangerous, most thankless job in your unit and go do it with them for a little while. Anywhere you are, on a base, on a ship, on a plane, walk around and feel what other people are feeling. Nothing is more important than the morale of a unit, and it is utterly dependent on leadership. General Douglas MacArthur once said this of morale: "It cannot be produced by pampering or coddling, and it is not necessarily destroyed by hardship, danger, or even calamity. It will wither quickly, however, if soldiers come to believe themselves victims of indifference, injustice, ignorance, personal ambition, or ineptitude on the part of their leaders." So I'm going to sum up with just a couple more words now. There is an axiom out there that there's no such thing as a bad regiment, only bad colonels. I realize that's an Army phrase, but you can add the correct positions and units to apply to the Navy. Some people attribute this phrase to Napoleon, others to Ulysses Grant. But I think it is apt because again and again, as I was researching my book, I would ask myself, what made 1st Platoon special? What made it all go so wrong? And again, I came to the conclusion that that collection of men were no better or worse than any other in the military. One of the perpetrators of the rape murder, Stephen Green, who, by the way, just a couple weeks ago committed suicide in prison. He was a special case perhaps because he had demonstrated clear sociopathic tendencies before even joining the Army. But blaming everything on him is not possible. These problems were too big for any one person or one private to make. The thing that separates those units from this one was the leadership that from the top down set the tone that allowed the unit to unravel. And there were many, many links in the error chain along the way that could have been broken but weren't. And finally, I'd like to quote George Orwell, who said, "To see what is in front of one's nose needs a constant struggle." We all have the benefit of hindsight, but virtually everyone I spoke to from other units who passed through Bravo's area of operations at that time said that they could see from miles away that most of the soldiers in that unit were combat ineffective. But a groupthink mentality had taken over, where leadership was absolutely unable or unwilling to see what was in front of their nose. I'm not saying that this is easy to do. Orwell acknowledges that it is not, and I'm sure it is doubly hard in a war zone. But that is the task before you. I think with a little more self-examination, that unit might have been able to see what was in front of its face. And so if I have one parting word of advice, one takeaway that I think will serve you well as you finish your studies here and take your first officer positions, just remember, if a catastrophe is beginning to unfold in your unit, and even though you will only start out as junior officers, you almost certainly have the power to break an error chain. The only question is, will you recognize what's at stake, and will you act on it? Thank you very much for listening to me tonight, and thank you for your service.
I'm going to see if they have any questions for you.
Okay.
We're now open up the floor for some questions if anybody has them. There are a few microphones around the auditorium. No questions?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, error chain. E-R-R-O-R. Error. Accident chain. I guess the aviation industry also uses the word accident chain, but I don't like the word accident because it makes it almost sound like it's unavoidable and nothing can help it. So yeah, it's error chain.
Anybody else? It's a good opportunity here.
West Point cadets always ask questions.
The West Point cadets ask questions. Sir?
I'd say, oh yeah, sure. The question was, I referenced earlier that I said that the battalion leadership turned on 1st Platoon and belittled them for their performance, which set off a spiral, a downward spiral even further. And the question was, when did that happen? I'd say that within about 2 months into the deployment, 1st Platoon started getting a reputation for being undisciplined, running a little fast and loose, and then they were involved in a couple of accidents and incidents involving their own deaths. A squad leader and a team leader were killed at point-blank range by an Iraqi assailant, and then the platoon leader was blown up with an IED, and the after-action report pointed to clearing techniques that were not properly followed. So those two things happened within a couple weeks of each other, and I'd say at that moment, with those two things happening, this was about now 3 months into the deployment, 1st Platoon got a reputation for just being jacked up, is the phrase they use. And then it was just over for 1st Platoon. They were the black sheep. They were the ones that were singled out for abuse. And in my opinion, it was, there was not an atmosphere of how do we, they were underperforming. I mean, there's no question. It was not a great platoon, but rather than trying to fix it, they were then almost punished for their bad performance as opposed to trying to pull it out of the fire. I can keep calling on them. I don't need you, you know. Sure. You have a question here in the front? Yeah, sir.
Over dinner, we talked, you were talking about the leadership, both at the NCO and staff NCO, and at the junior officer level, were sometimes wanting to be liked, wanting to be part of the team, dominated over getting it right, wanting to be liked. And you said that you saw this thread moving through, and I think it's a challenge we all face. You know, to be liked and still be respected, but it seemed like they defaulted overboard to the I want to be liked more so than I want to get this right for my mission.
Right. Yeah, sure. So we had dinner before before this event, and we were just talking about various leadership styles and challenges to both young and old leaders. And I guess I was asked to comment on this because it's particularly germane to you guys, I think, because in my opinion, many of the problems that this unit in Black Hearts had was because some of the platoon leaders, and so, you know, these are 2nd lieutenants and 1st lieutenants in the Army, which is, you know, the age and rank you guys are going to be in just a couple of years, they seemed to want to be friends with the enlisted men and their subordinates rather than be their bosses or be their officers. And I think as you and all junior officers navigate those waters, I think it's particularly challenging because the flip side of that is it doesn't mean you need to be a jerk, and it doesn't mean you earn your stripes as a leader by yelling at people who are older than you just because you can, but it's almost equally damaging to lose some of your leadership backbone because you just so desperately want to be liked by these cool guys, you know, who are combat veterans and they've been around the block, and you so desperately want to do a good job that you can easily veer into the mistake of thinking that being liked by them is the same thing as doing a good job. And I think there was a couple of those in Black Hearts, and I think it certainly wasn't the biggest problem that the unit had, but it didn't help. It didn't help at all. I mean, I think if they had the right platoon sergeant or the right platoon leaders at exactly the right moment, this error chain that we're talking about, that would have been a broken link, but it all piled up on each other, on itself. Is that adequately addressed? Okay, any more? Yes, question here and then 2 back, so I'll get you first. Okay, that's a good question. She asked, when I was reporting in Iraq, did I witness anything that I would call a part of the error chain, and how able was I to point this out and do something about it? I don't want to downplay my own macho combat reporting, but I was in the Triangle of Death in 2008, which was a drastically different place than it was in 2006. So I had to report this out by going there after they had been there. I was not embedded with them or their unit. So my war stories are not great just because there's not a lot of them, because in 2008, the Triangle of Death was astonishingly safe. I mean, it was, I probably, you know, IEDs were still a routine occurrence, but I wasn't involved in any of it. You would hear them go off more than I experienced one. And you would hear gunfire, but it was never what I would consider under fire. So this is all to say that during my time in that particular zone, I didn't see anything but the most ideal behavior. I mean, everybody was wired tight. I mean, everything was by the book. Now, if I had seen something, it would be hard to say a hypothetical because it depends on what it would be. I mean, I saw some soldiers whose shoelaces weren't tied, but I'm not sure I would, upbraid them for that. All right, and we had another question too back. Yeah, that's you. Yeah. Yep. Yes. I think that if you are asked to have your people pull 66 hours of continuous watch, or are expected to go out on patrol 16 hours a day, I'm not talking being on the job, I'm talking about going on active patrols, kicking down doors for 16 hours a day for 3 weeks on end. I know the military is hard to say no to superiors, but I think that is the time where you say, we can't pull 66 hours of continuous watch. It's not humanly possible. People are going to make mistakes, and mistakes are going to get people killed. Now, I will say, to be fair to everyone in the book, I provided you a particularly stark example that sounds so brilliantly easy to say so, but I mean, there's so many complicated and mitigating factors, and people are running around open combat zones that, in fact, the 66 hours of continuous patrol is somebody comes in from a 12-hour patrol, oh, the captain needs you to go back out because there's an election happening, so you need to turn around, and then they get sent back out, and then the eye in the sky loses them, and so they're wandering around literally in the wilderness for 6 or 8 hours. So, I mean, these are complicated issues, but I do think that that's a very good example of when that human beings can't do that. It's just not possible, but they were asked to do that repeatedly. And, I think that if you needed a ground zero case of what not having enough boots on the ground means, you just need to look at Bravo Company's duty rosters. When the surge happened, I think 2 battalions filled the space that 1 battalion was covering. So, they were just 5 months later, there was double the number of men just in that zone alone. So I guess the Army got the message at that point. More questions? How long do we have anyway? Okay, yeah, I'm falling down on the job. Sorry about that. Yes? Blackhearts. Where did the name Blackhearts come from? That is a great story that is outlined exhaustively in the book, so you should buy it and you should read it. No. Blackhearts. So there were parts of there were 4 brigades in the original 101st Airborne Division, which, if you've read or seen Band of Brothers, was one of the original actual paratrooper divisions. And so when that when that division was formed and they had 4 brigades, open drop paratrooping over, the farmlands of France, it was very complicated to reconstitute brigades back into a workable fighting formation. So they had a bunch of tricks for getting comrades in arms back with their unit. There were pitch whistles, flashlight signals, and one of them was that they had painted stencils for the 4 suits of decks of cards on their helmets. So I think if you watched band of brothers, the 506th was spades, so they were all wearing spades. This is the 502nd, so they had hearts. And then around 2002, when cloth helmet covers came into being, they obviously couldn't do white stencil anymore, so they changed to black stitched patches. And so they got a new nickname because they were the Black Hearts. And so really the nickname is actually not for the platoon or even the company, it's for the entire brigade of the 502nd Infantry Regiment. But there's a little World War II lore for you, how they got their name. Excellent. Interesting, isn't it? Fascinating. More questions? We're good?
There, sir.
Okay.
On behalf of the Stockdale, clap for it a little bit. Sir, on behalf of the Stockdale Center and the Brigade of Midshipmen, we'd like to present you this small gift as a token of our appreciation for coming out and speaking tonight.
Thanks very much. Thank you, sir.
Attention on deck.